I was really excited to get my hands on this game as soon as I heard it had been announced. I'd been a fan of the hobby for quite some time already, and I'd played through Space Marine and Space Hulk Deathwing a good while before, although I hadn't quite finished either of them in their entirety yet. It doesn't take a lot of intuition to figure out that Darktide just refers to the same principle as Vermintide, just in a separate IP. I knew that the shared developer and core idea meant that I could get a fair idea of what I was in for by trying out the Age of Sigmar precursor. I have very little knowledge of AOS, but in the hour or so that I played of Vermintide 2, I did develop a good deal of excitement for what was to come. The idea of playing a hacking, slashing FPS co-op combat game set in one of my favourite sci-fi settings was something I began to very highly anticipate, and the feelings of excitement only grew when I learned that Dan Abnett, the man who wrote most 40k lore, would be taking on the helm. Now, I'm not as naive as I might come across in a lot of my other videos. I've been burned by games before. I knew that anticipating a big release nowadays can often leave you with a sour aftertaste upon release. Plenty of pre-orders over the past few years resulted in me developing trust issues, especially towards the gaming industry. So, when I saw the projected release date for Darktide come and go on Steam, I decided to force myself to relax a little and not to anticipate very much. Then this video launched.
I'm here to talk to you about an opportunity to try a smaller preview of server systems and the backend and all of those techie bits. So stay tuned for more chances to help us test the game in the time leading up until launch on November 30th.
The gaming industry has become so overwhelmed with negative feedback and backlash when it comes to launches, testing, closed betas and more, that Fatshark decided to release something that explained what would be going on during the closed beta weekend. It was really clever. Part of me was disappointed that they had to explain to players that this wasn't a completed game. Obviously this was a beta test, and this wouldn't be a full showcase of what the game had to offer. This was a chance to get hands-on with the major features and provide feedback and data to help with how well it runs. But years of getting exactly what we want mean that players have become demanding and impatient, almost choosing not to understand the point of these sorts of events. Props to Fatshark for outlining everything to mitigate this ahead of time. Sure enough, when I logged into play, there were a few issues I had to contend with, the major one being that when I tried to play with an already created character, I was met with endless load screens. I gave the game a few minutes, 20 to be exact, to load, in case it was a server issue or otherwise, before deciding to reboot and create a new character. I rushed through the character creator because I was more interested in full-fledged gameplay and wanted to leave that other stuff for later on when the game actually came out. I found that the issue had been resolved. Before long, we were in the hub, a very well-constructed pre-game lobby that's a little bit like being in the Eye of Terror. With my character untangled from the mutated horror of the spawn point, I immediately made for the mission select area, keen to get down to killing cultists. My setup wasn't the best in the world, but while moving through the lobby, I noticed that my frame rate would drop quite significantly, possibly because of the number of players in the server. Getting into a mission was extremely easy, which is a lot to ask for at the minute. The selection screen was quite a lot like Deep Rock Galactic's mission select, and anything that reminds me of DRG is good. Almost immediately, I was in a queue to join a match. Now, before I managed to get into one of the missions, I was disconnected, but something that really impressed me when this happened was that the game automatically reconnected me and made sure I was put back into the same matchmaking group for the mission. That's something a lot of other studios could learn from here. And just like that, it was mission time. Like I said before, my setup is far from the best. It runs games, but running a game and a stream at the same time was a lot to ask for. And later in the session, I did learn how to preserve some frames using settings changes, but you'll have to deal with some frame drops for now. Almost immediately, I was having fun. Connection issues meant that I moved a little slower than the others in my team, and coupling that with frame drops meant I was probably more of a nuisance than an asset at times. But even at the issues I was running into, hacking and slashing through cultists was extremely enjoyable from the outset. Now, one thing I was worried about in this game was that I'd be a little too similar to Deathwing, and that it'd be nothing but combat, completely leaving out interactions, gameplay mechanics, and other more advanced features in favor of just all-out destroying everything in your path. You know, after all, we're not Terminators here, we're a little more refined. I was a little bit disappointed to find that the interactions were slightly limited, but I think that the missions we were restricted to in the beta were more likely to be ones limited in terms of gameplay in order to keep things simple. There were a few mission interactions along the way, but some more variation in gameplay would be fun to break up the endless killing. Since I'd had to create a new character in the stream, I'd chosen a Psyker instead of an Ogryn, and despite not having played much with the Ogryn, the difference in style between the two characters was massive. Too many times I tried to play with the brute force and all-out attack style of the Ogryn when using the Psyker, and almost all of those times I ended up getting my ass handed to me. Props to the actual Ogryns on my team who revived me about 17 times in each mission. Some features I enjoyed about playing as the Psyker were the special abilities granted to you for dealing with those more challenging combat encounters. I couldn't get the melee special to work while I was playing. I put that down to being too low a level to get it yet. But aside from that, I was able to send out Psychic Blast, which would knock down large groups of enemies and render them ultimately more manageable as a group. As well as that, instead of grenades, I had quite a fun ability to psychokinetically pop enemy heads, which I used many times because of how much fun it was to use. I didn't actually notice until quite late on that doing it too many times in a row could result in warp corruption, which would down my character. And we know that all along we would expect some really good attention to detail from this game, but this was something that I really admired. Even the bolt revolver thing that the Psyker carried was fun to use when my graphics card granted me enough frames to use it. Ultimately, I did have a great time playing this game while it was available. I can't say I was very good at it, but I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm really looking forward to playing the completed, polished version when it's available. Any bugs or glitches I ran into while I played were expected, like the endless load screens at the beginning and the server drops later on. Nothing I encountered got in the way of gameplay, but there were the occasional graphics glitches, which I actually thought made the game much more entertaining. If all that's left for this game is to get polished up and ready to ship, I'm very excited. Did you play the closed beta? What did you think? Tell me in the comments.